Are you lost? Or do you just enjoy sitting where you do not belong? The question landed across the lunch table with enough sweetness to make it cruel. Forks slowed. A glass touched a plate and made a small, bright sound. At Bellwether Grill, 3 blocks from City Hall, the noon crowd had been loud only seconds earlier, but the space around Nia Bennett suddenly felt strangely still. Nia looked up from the folder beside her plate. Across from her stood Madison Whitmore, 25, polished from her cream-colored coat to the gold watch at her wrist, wearing the effortless confidence of someone who had rarely been told no. 2 women stood behind Madison, exchanging uncomfortable smiles. Nia kept one hand around her water glass. The condensation was cold against her fingers. "I have a reservation," she said. Madison glanced at the table, then back at Nia. "This section is being used for an important lunch. So is this table." Nia's voice remained quiet. That seemed to bother Madison more than anger would have. Nia had arrived 20 minutes early because the meeting mattered. Inside the folder were neighborhood maps, rent projections, public records, and testimony from families living near the proposed Riverside Commons redevelopment. In less than an hour, she was supposed to meet 2 housing advocates and a city planning consultant. The restaurant had been chosen because it was neutral ground. At least, that was what Nia had believed. Madison gave a short laugh. "Do you know who I am?" Nia looked at her for a moment. "Should that change my reservation?" The silence tightened. A server stopped near the kitchen entrance. At the next table, a man lowered his coffee cup without drinking. Madison's smile disappeared. "My father runs this city." "Your father is the mayor." Nia corrected her gently. "The city belongs to the people who live in it." One of Madison's friends whispered her name, warning her to stop. She did not. Instead, Madison called for the manager with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having discomfort removed before it became inconvenient. When the manager approached, Madison pointed toward Nia. "She is causing a problem." Nia felt every nearby face turn toward her. Heat climbed beneath her collar, but she did not stand. She opened the reservation confirmation on her phone and placed it on the table. "Table 12, 12:30. Bennett." The manager read the screen. His expression changed. "The reservation is valid." Madison stared at him. "Then move her." Nia's heartbeat struck once, hard. She could have shouted. She could have reached for the anger gathering beneath her ribs. Instead, she looked directly at Madison. "Are you asking me to leave because I broke a rule?" she asked. "Or because you decided I do not belong here?" Nobody moved. Somewhere behind them, a phone camera quietly lifted. Madison's face hardened, but what she said next was not the insult Nia expected. "People like you always make everything about discrimination. Maybe worry about Riverside Commons instead. That project is already decided." Nia went completely still. Riverside Commons had not been publicly approved. The final review was scheduled for next month. Even the redevelopment terms were supposed to remain under negotiation. Yet Madison had spoken as if the decision had already been made. Nia slowly released the water glass. The cold ring it left on the table looked almost perfectly circular. For the first time since Madison approached her, humiliation was no longer the most important thing in the room. Nia closed her folder carefully and studied the mayor's daughter with a different kind of attention. "What did you just say?" she asked. Madison smiled again, unaware that with one careless sentence, she had changed the entire conversation. Nia did not ask the question twice. Madison's smile held for another second, then shifted at the edges, as if she had finally realized she had stepped somewhere she had not intended to go. "I said what I said," she replied, reaching for the chair beside her. "Everybody knows that project is happening." "Everybody?" Nia asked. Madison rolled her eyes. "You know what I mean." Nia did. That was exactly the problem. Before she could press further, the restaurant door opened and 2 familiar faces entered from the bright afternoon sidewalk. One was Aaron Mitchell, a housing advocate carrying a worn leather messenger bag. The other was Claire Dawson, an independent city planning consultant who had spent the past 6 months reviewing displacement projections for Riverside Commons. They slowed when they saw the people gathered around table 12. "Nia?" Aaron called. Madison glanced toward them, then back at Nia. Something in her confidence flickered. Nia stood, gathered her folder, and thanked the manager without explaining what had happened. She could feel the phone cameras following her movements, but she refused to perform for them. "Enjoy your lunch," she told Madison. No sarcasm. No raised voice. That calm followed Madison more effectively than an insult could have. Nia moved with Aaron and Claire to a smaller table near the back windows. Only when she sat down did she notice that her hands were trembling. She placed them beneath the table until they stopped. Aaron leaned closer. "What happened?" "Later," Nia said. She opened the folder. "Work first." That habit had been built years before, long before anyone at City Hall knew her name. Nia had grown up 8 miles from downtown in a 2-bedroom apartment where her mother, Diane Bennett, worked long shifts at a medical billing office and still came home with enough patience to help neighbors understand letters they were afraid to open. Rent increases, utility notices, insurance forms, government language that could change a life while sounding almost meaningless on paper. Nia learned early that important decisions were often hidden inside ordinary sentences. At 17, she watched a family across the hall pack their belongings into borrowed boxes after a redevelopment company purchased their building. By 24, she worked as a community research analyst for Harbor Bridge Housing Alliance, earning less than most of the people whose reports she challenged, but knowing exactly what a $500 rent increase could do to a family already choosing between groceries and medication. Riverside Commons was supposed to bring investment to the east side. New apartments, retail space, restaurants, public plazas. The brochures showed trees, bicycles, and smiling families. The numbers told another story. Nearly 400 existing households could face displacement if the affordability requirements were weakened. Nia had spent months tracing property records and public meeting notes, trying to understand why certain protections kept disappearing from revised proposals. Now Madison's careless sentence sat in her mind like a stone. "The final approval is next month," Claire said, studying a spreadsheet. "Nothing is decided yet." Nia looked through the window toward City Hall, its pale stone columns visible beyond the traffic. "That is what I thought." Aaron noticed her expression. "What are you not telling us?" Nia reached into her bag and removed a small notebook. She wrote down Madison's exact words while they were still fresh. Then she added the time, the restaurant, the table number, and the names of everyone who had been present. Her mother had taught her something years ago when a landlord tried to deny making a promise he had made in person. Memory can be questioned. Records are harder to dismiss. Nia closed the notebook. Across the restaurant, Madison was laughing again, surrounded by people who had already returned to their lunches. But Nia was no longer thinking about the humiliation. She was thinking about Riverside Commons, for 100 families, and a decision that apparently existed before the public had been allowed to make it. By 2:15 that afternoon, Madison Whitmore had already convinced herself the restaurant incident was over. She crossed the marble lobby of City Hall without slowing, sunglasses pushed into her blonde hair, her phone glowing with messages she barely read. The receptionist greeted her by name. A security officer opened the interior gate before she reached it. Upstairs, an assistant carrying 3 folders stepped aside to let her pass. Madison noticed none of it because doors had been opening for her for so long that she had stopped seeing the hands that opened them. Her father, Mayor Richard Whitmore, had occupied the corner office for nearly 6 years. His photograph appeared at ribbon cuttings, charity dinners, school openings, and construction announcements across the city. To Madison, however, his influence was less visible and more useful. It was the restaurant table suddenly becoming available, the parking citation quietly disappearing, the event organizer finding 2 additional seats after saying the room was full. She had grown up believing these things happened because people liked her. No one had ever explained how often they were simply afraid to disappoint her last name. "Your father is in a meeting," his executive assistant said as Madison approached the office. "I will wait. It could be an hour." Madison smiled. "Tell him it is me." Less than 3 minutes later, the office door opened. Richard Whitmore stood beside a conference table with 2 senior aides and a man Madison recognized from campaign fundraisers, Charles Vance, president of Vance Urban Development. A large map of the east side covered the table. Colored lines marked several blocks surrounding Riverside Commons. Madison entered without being invited. "There she is," Charles said warmly. "The mayor's favorite constituent." Richard gave his daughter a tired look. "We are working. I need 5 minutes." One aide immediately began gathering documents. Charles closed a black portfolio, but not before Madison noticed the familiar Riverside logo printed across one page. She had seen the same logo weeks earlier during dinner at her father's house, when Charles had spoken about construction schedules and investment partners as though city approval were merely a calendar detail. Richard waited until the room cleared. What happened? Madison dropped into a leather chair. Some woman embarrassed me at Bellwether. Her father remained standing. What woman? I do not know. Nia something. She had documents about Riverside Commons. Richard's expression changed so slightly that Madison almost missed it. What did you tell her? Nothing important. Madison. His voice lowered. She looked away. I said the project was already decided. The air conditioner hummed above them. Richard walked slowly to the window. 30 floors below, traffic moved around City Hall in neat streams. Why would you say that? Because Charles talks about it constantly. Everyone knows it is happening. Richard turned. No, everyone does not know. For the first time that day, Madison felt something colder than embarrassment. She was nobody, Dad. Richard stared at his daughter. Nobody. Madison shrugged. Just some girl from a housing group. Richard's jaw tightened. He had spent 20 years in politics learning that the people dismissed as nobody were often the ones who remembered everything. Did anyone record you? He asked. Madison thought about the phones rising around the restaurant. Maybe. Richard closed his eyes for 1 second. Then his desk phone rang. His assistant's voice came through the speaker. Mayor, communications needs you immediately. There is a video spreading online from Bellwether Grill. Madison sat straighter. Richard looked at her, and suddenly the office felt much smaller. How bad? He asked. A pause followed. Sir, the assistant said carefully, they are not talking about the lunch anymore. People are asking how your daughter knew Riverside Commons was already decided. Richard Whitmore did not answer immediately. He reached for the tablet on his desk and opened the video his communications director had sent. The footage was shaky, recorded from several tables away, but the sound was painfully clear. Madison's voice filled the office. Her question about whether Nia belonged there. Her demand that the manager move her. Then Nia's calm response, followed by the sentence that had changed everything. Riverside Commons was already decided. Richard stopped the video before it ended. How many views? He asked. His communications director stood near the doorway holding a phone against her chest. More than 200,000 in the last hour. Local reporters have it now. Madison rose from the chair. People are taking it out of context. What context makes it better? Richard asked. She stared at him. The question seemed to offend her more than the situation itself. She embarrassed me first. Richard looked toward the window. Outside, afternoon sunlight reflected from the courthouse roof, bright enough to make him narrow his eyes. Go home, Madison. Dad. Now. 20 minutes later, across town, Nia sat at her desk inside Harbor Bridge Housing Alliance while her phone vibrated almost continuously beside her keyboard. Messages from strangers. Interview requests. Supportive comments. Cruel comments. People arguing about her face, her clothes, her voice, and whether she had looked angry enough or too calm. Nia turned the phone face down. Aaron stood beside her desk. 3 television stations want you tonight. No. Nia, this could put pressure on City Hall. The video is putting pressure on City Hall. She opened her notebook to the page where she had written Madison's words. I want to know why she knew. Claire arrived carrying printed copies of the latest Riverside Commons planning documents. She placed them beside Nia's keyboard. I checked every public filing. There is no final approval. Nia leaned back. The office smelled faintly of old coffee and printer toner. Outside the narrow windows, buses moved through evening traffic. Then someone told her something. Aaron lowered his voice. Or she heard something she was never supposed to hear. Nia remembered Madison standing over the lunch table, confident enough to treat a public decision as settled fact. She remembered the way Richard Whitmore's name seemed to change the behavior of everyone around his daughter. A surname could open doors. Sometimes it could also hide what happened behind them. Nia reached for her phone, but before she could unlock it, an incoming call appeared. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Nia Bennett? A woman asked. Yes. My name is Elena Torres. I am an investigative reporter with the City Ledger. We spoke last year about housing displacement. Nia remembered her immediately. Elena had investigated a zoning dispute on the south side and had told Nia to call if she ever found evidence that public decisions were being influenced before public hearings occurred. I saw the video, Elena continued. I am not calling about what happened at the restaurant. Nia looked at Claire. Then why are you calling? A brief silence followed. Because 3 months ago, someone inside City Hall sent me records involving Vance Urban Development. The documents were incomplete, and I could never prove what they meant. Nia's fingers tightened around the phone. What kind of records? Meeting calendars, private dinners, draft redevelopment, terms that appeared before the public review process began. Nia looked down at the Riverside Commons documents spread across her desk. Suddenly, the missing pieces seemed closer together. Do you have the name Charles Vance? She asked. Elena went silent. When she finally answered, her voice had changed. Nia, how do you know that name? Nia turned toward the darkening window, where City Hall stood several blocks away beneath the fading light. Because I think the mayor's daughter just told us where to start looking. Elena did not ask Nia to explain everything over the phone. Not on this line, she said. Meet me somewhere quiet. 40 minutes later, Nia sat in the back corner of a 24-hour diner on Peachtree Street, a mug of untouched coffee cooling between her hands. Rain had begun tapping against the windows, turning the lights outside into blurred streaks of red and gold. Elena Torres arrived carrying a canvas messenger bag and the tired expression of someone who had spent years learning that important truths rarely arrived neatly organized. She slid into the booth across from Nia and placed a thick folder on the table. Before you look at anything, Elena said, tell me exactly what happened. Nia did. She described the reservation, Madison's demand that she leave, the manager, the phone's recording, and finally the sentence about Riverside Commons. Elena listened without interrupting. When Nia finished, she opened the folder. Inside were copies of public calendars, campaign finance reports, property records, and photographs taken outside restaurants and private fundraising events. One name appeared repeatedly. Charles Vance. Vance Urban Development began purchasing property near Riverside Commons 14 months ago, Elena said. That is not unusual by itself. Developers buy land before projects become public all the time. She turned another page. This is what bothers me. Nia leaned closer. The document showed a meeting listed on the mayor's official calendar as a community development briefing. The attendee list had been removed from the public version, but Elena had obtained an earlier copy through a records request. Charles Vance was listed. So were two senior planning officials. The date was 4 months before the first public hearing. Still not proof of wrongdoing, Nia said. Elena nodded. Exactly. Access is not corruption. A private meeting is not automatically illegal. That is why I never published. Nia appreciated the answer. She had seen too many people decide what they wanted a document to mean before reading what it actually said. Then what changed? Elena asked. Nia opened her notebook and read Madison's exact statement. Elena wrote it down. You are certain those were her words? There are at least 3 recordings. Elena sat back. Rainwater traced thin lines down the window beside them. If Madison knew the project was already decided, there are only a few possibilities. She was exaggerating. Someone told her confidential information, or decisions were being made before the public process was complete. And we do not know which one, Nia said. Not yet. Nia looked at the documents again. One photograph showed Richard Whitmore and Charles Vance leaving a private dinner. Another showed Madison at a campaign fundraiser beside Charles, smiling beneath strings of white lights. Nothing in the images proved anything. But together, they created a question that would not disappear. Nia's phone vibrated. A message from Claire appeared on the screen. She had found something unusual in 2 versions of the Riverside proposal. Nia opened the attached pages. In the earlier version, developers were required to reserve 20% of the new apartments at below market rates. In the later draft, the requirement had fallen to 8%. No public explanation accompanied the change. Nia turned the phone toward Elena. The reporter read silently. That difference could affect dozens of families, she said. More than dozens, Nia replied. Her voice was quiet now. Potentially hundreds over time. Elena closed the folder. I need sources inside City Hall. Documents. Confirmation. Something stronger than a viral video. Nia looked through the rain toward the distant outline of downtown. That morning, she had gone to lunch hoping to protect families from being pushed out of their neighborhood. By nightfall, she was sitting across from an investigative reporter discussing decisions that might have been shaped before ordinary residents ever entered the room. What do you need from me? Nia asked. Elena studied her carefully. Nothing reckless. Nothing illegal. You keep doing what you already do. Follow the public record. Nia nodded. She understood. Truth did not need shortcuts. It needed patience. She reached for the folder containing her own months of research and placed it between them. Then start with this, she said. Elena opened the first page. Her eyes stopped on a handwritten timeline Nia had built from public meetings, property purchases, and revised housing requirements. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she pointed to 3 dates. Nia, she whispered. These changes happened immediately after meetings that were never disclosed as negotiations. Nia felt the diner suddenly become very quiet. The humiliation at Bellwether Grill had felt personal. This did not. This was larger. Somewhere between private dinners and public promises, hundreds of families might have been reduced to numbers on a development plan. Nia looked at Elena across the table. Then maybe Madison did not accidentally reveal a secret, she said. Maybe she accidentally confirmed a pattern. By 9 the next morning, Nia had slept less than 4 hours. The rain had cleared, leaving the city washed in pale sunlight. But her apartment still felt dim as she sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by printed records. Diane Bennett placed a plate of scrambled eggs beside her daughter and looked at the documents covering nearly every available inch of wood. You planning to eat any of that paper? She asked. Nia almost smiled. I am working. You have been working since before sunrise. Diane poured coffee into a chipped blue mug and sat across from her. She had already seen the restaurant video. Everyone had. But she had not asked Nia why she had stayed calm or why she had not shouted back. Diane understood that kind of silence. It was not surrender. Sometimes it was the only way to hear what another person revealed when they believed they had already won. Nia pushed 1 page toward her mother. The affordable housing requirement dropped from 20% to 8% between these 2 drafts. Diane studied the numbers. What does that mean for the neighborhood? It means fewer families can afford to stay. Then that is the story. Nia looked up. Diane tapped the viral video playing silently on Nia's phone. Not this. Nia followed her mother's finger. On the screen, Madison stood beside the lunch table, frozen in the middle of a sentence millions of strangers were now debating. People want me to talk about what she did to me. You can, Diane said. But do not let what she did to you become bigger than what might happen to everyone else. The words stayed with Nia all morning. At Harbor Bridge, reporters waited outside the entrance. Nia used the side door and went directly to the records room, where Aaron had stacked boxes of public planning documents against one wall. Claire was already comparing meeting dates on a whiteboard. At 11:15, Elena called. I found someone, she said. A former planning department employee. They will not go on record yet, but they confirmed that revised affordability numbers circulated internally before the public hearings. Nia stood completely still. Did the mayor's office see them? That is what I am trying to prove. Nia looked at the timeline taped across the wall. One date suddenly caught her attention. A private development briefing. 3 days later, the affordability requirement changed. 2 weeks after that, Charles Vance's company purchased another property bordering the project. None of it alone proved misconduct. Together, it demanded an explanation. Elena, Nia said, I think there is someone else you should call. She gave her the name of a neighborhood association president who had repeatedly requested the missing redevelopment drafts and been told they did not exist. Then Nia called Marcus Reed at the city ethics office. She had met him once during a public records workshop the previous year. When he answered, she did not mention Madison's insult. She did not mention the video views. She described dates, documents, undisclosed meetings, and the unexplained change in housing requirements. Marcus listened quietly. Can you send me what you have? Everything is from public records. Good. Nia looked through the glass wall of the records room. Outside, her co-workers were watching another television crew arrive. What happens after I send it? She asked. I review it. If there is sufficient basis, the office determines whether a formal inquiry is appropriate. No promises. No dramatic declaration. Just process. Nia felt strangely relieved. I will send it now. She ended the call and attached the timeline, the proposal drafts, the public calendars, and the records requests. Her finger hovered over the button for 1 second before she pressed it. The message disappeared from the screen with no sound at all. That was the call that mattered. Not because Marcus Reed could end anyone's career with a sentence, but because the truth had finally reached a place where power could not simply laugh it away. Across town, inside the mayor's office, Richard Whitmore was preparing a statement calling the restaurant incident an unfortunate misunderstanding when his chief counsel entered carrying a sealed notification. Richard read the first line twice. The city ethics office had opened a preliminary review into communications involving Riverside Commons. He slowly lowered the paper. For the first time since the video appeared, nobody in the room was looking at Madison. They were looking at him. Richard Whitmore kept the ethics notification face down on his desk for almost a full minute. Around him, the communications team waited with laptops open and a statement ready for approval. The statement described the restaurant confrontation as an unfortunate misunderstanding between two young women. It said Madison regretted that her words had been interpreted negatively. It said the mayor remained committed to equality, transparency, and respectful public dialogue. Richard read the language again and felt how carefully it avoided saying anything at all. "Release it," he said. His chief counsel looked toward the sealed notification. "Richard, I think we should wait. If we wait, everyone assumes we are hiding. And if we speak before we understand the review?" Richard leaned back in his chair. Through the windows, City Hall Plaza was filling with reporters. "Then we control the conversation before someone else does." Across town, Nia refused her fifth interview request of the morning. The video had passed 3 million views, and strangers had begun turning her into whatever version of her they needed. To some, she was courageous. To others, difficult. Some praised her restraint. Others insisted she had planned the entire confrontation. Nia stopped reading after a stranger argued that her calm expression proved she had not really been humiliated. She closed the browser and returned to the documents. At 12:40, Elena called. The mayor just released a statement. Nia listened while Elena read it aloud. When she reached the phrase "unfortunate misunderstanding," Nia looked down at the notebook where Madison's exact words remained written in blue ink. "He is making it about the restaurant," Nia said. "Yes. Then he is hoping nobody asks about Riverside Commons." Elena was quiet for a moment. "People are asking." By mid-afternoon, the first article appeared. It did not accuse Richard of corruption. Elena was too careful for that. Instead, it presented a timeline: private meetings with Charles Vance, changes to affordable housing requirements, unanswered public records requests, and Madison's recorded claim that the project had already been decided. Every statement was attached to a document or clearly identified as an unanswered question. That restraint made the story harder to dismiss. At City Hall, phones began ringing before Richard finished reading the second paragraph. One council member requested an independent briefing. Another publicly called for the Riverside Commons vote to be delayed. Charles Vance sent 3 messages and then called directly. Richard stared at the name on his screen before answering. "Do not call me again today," he said. "Richard, we need to get ahead of this. That is exactly what everyone is going to think we have been doing." He ended the call. At Harbor Bridge, Nia stood beside Claire in the records room as evening light faded across the whiteboard. Claire pointed to a new email on her laptop. The planning department had announced that all pending Riverside Commons approvals would be temporarily postponed while the ethics review proceeded. Aaron let out a breath behind them. "You did it." Nia shook her head. "Nothing has been done yet. The vote is stopped." "Paused," she corrected. She thought of her mother telling her not to let one woman's cruelty become bigger than hundreds of families. The pause mattered, but it was not justice. It was only time. Then Nia's phone rang. "Marcus Reed." "Ms. Bennett," he said, "we reviewed the materials you submitted." His voice remained measured. "The preliminary review has identified sufficient concerns to open a formal ethics inquiry." Nia closed her eyes briefly. Around her, the office printer continued humming. Someone laughed in the hallway, unaware of the words being spoken. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we follow the evidence." At City Hall, Richard received the same notification minutes later. This time, there was no prepared statement waiting on his desk. No phrase polished enough to make the problem smaller. He stood alone beside the window as camera lights gathered below. For years, his name had opened doors for his daughter. Now one careless sentence had opened a door he could no longer close. The formal inquiry changed the temperature inside City Hall. By 8 the next morning, staff members who normally stopped outside Richard Whitmore's office to exchange jokes moved past the door with their eyes lowered. His chief counsel, Margaret Ellis, sat across from him with a legal pad resting untouched on her lap. The ethics office requested calendars, internal messages, redevelopment drafts, and communications involving Vance Urban Development, she said. Richard stared at the list. Then give them what they requested. Margaret did not move. All of it. The question irritated him because he understood why she was asking. What exactly are you suggesting? I am asking whether there is anything I need to know before investigators find it first. Richard stood and walked toward the window. Below, reporters waited behind temporary barriers across the plaza. Charles wanted certainty before committing private investment. We discussed timelines. Before the public process was complete, Richard turned. We discussed possibilities. Margaret's expression remained unreadable. Then let the records show that. An hour later, Madison arrived through the private entrance wearing dark glasses and carrying a coffee she never touched. Richard had told her to stay away from City Hall, but she had ignored him. People are following me, she said as soon as the office door closed. Reporters are calling my friends. Someone posted my apartment building online. Richard's anger softened for a moment. You should stay somewhere private until this settles. Make it settle. He looked at her. Madison removed her glasses. For the first time since the restaurant, she looked frightened rather than offended. You are the mayor, she said. Do something. Richard heard the expectation beneath those words. It was the same expectation he had spent years quietly teaching her. Problems disappeared. Doors opened. People reconsidered. His title had become a family shelter from consequences. I cannot stop an ethics investigation, he said. Madison stared at him as though he had suddenly confessed to being powerless. Then what good is any of this? The question followed Richard long after she left. By noon, his communications director presented a new strategy. They could challenge the inquiry as politically motivated. They could emphasize Nia's connection to a housing advocacy organization and suggest she had used the restaurant incident to advance an agenda. Richard listened without interrupting. Would it work? He finally asked. It would change the conversation. That was not an answer, but it was enough. By 3 o'clock, an anonymous source had provided a local political blog with information portraying Harbor Bridge Housing Alliance as an activist organization determined to stop development across the city. Nia saw the article while sitting beside Diane at her kitchen table. Her mother's reading glasses rested low on her nose as she studied the screen. They are trying to make you the problem, Diane said. Nia felt something colder than anger settle inside her. The article used photographs from her public social media accounts. It questioned her motives. It suggested her research was part of a coordinated campaign. Nothing directly accused her of dishonesty, but every sentence invited the reader to doubt her. Her phone rang. Elena, do not respond yet, the reporter said. Why? Because I just received something. Nia stood. What? Papers shifted on Elena's end of the call. An internal email from the mayor's communications office. It was sent this morning. Nia waited. It discusses redirecting media attention toward your organization and your personal motivations. Diane slowly removed her glasses. Nia looked at the article again. Richard had been given a choice between transparency and protection. He had chosen protection. Can you verify the email? Nia asked. I am working on it now. Then do not publish until you can. Elena went quiet. They are attacking you, Nia. That does not make unverified evidence true. Diane looked at her daughter, and something like pride moved quietly across her face. Nia closed the article. If we become careless because they were careless first, then none of this means anything. Across town, Margaret Ellis entered Richard's office carrying a printed copy of the same leaked email. She placed it on his desk without sitting down. Tell me you did not approve this strategy. Richard looked at the page. For the first time, the silence in his office did not feel powerful. It felt empty. Richard did not deny it. Margaret stood across from his desk, waiting for an explanation that never came. The printed email between them looked harmless at first glance, just a page of polished language about media strategy, public confidence, and restoring focus. But one sentence had been highlighted in yellow. Emphasized Ms. Bennett's advocacy role and potential political motivations to reduce the credibility of her allegations. Margaret tapped the page once. Did you approve this? Richard looked toward the closed office door. I approve changing the conversation. That is not what I asked. He finally met her eyes. Yes. Margaret slowly sat down. Then you have made this worse. Richard's jaw tightened. Nia Bennett submitted documents designed to damage this administration. She submitted public records to an ethics office. After publicly humiliating my daughter. Margaret stared at him. Richard, your daughter approached her. The words landed quietly. That made them harder to fight. Before he could answer, his desk phone rang. The ethics office had expanded its document request to include communications between the mayor's staff and outside media organizations. Richard closed his eyes. The strategy meant to protect him had become another subject of investigation. Across town, Elena spent 6 hours verifying the leaked email before publishing a single sentence about it. She confirmed the sender, the recipients, the timestamp, and the internal formatting with 2 independent sources. When her article appeared that evening, it did not describe a conspiracy. It simply showed that while publicly promising transparency, members of the mayor's communications operation had discussed undermining the woman whose records helped trigger the inquiry. The reaction was immediate. 2 major civic organizations suspended their endorsements of Richard. A longtime campaign donor issued a statement requesting full cooperation with investigators. 3 city council members called for an independent review of Riverside comments. Charles Vance stopped answering reporters entirely. At Harbor Bridge, Nia watched none of it live. She sat in the records room with Claire, comparing property transactions against campaign finance disclosures. At 9:17, Claire suddenly leaned toward her screen. Nia. There was something different in her voice. Nia moved beside her. A contribution from a political action committee appeared 6 weeks before the affordable housing requirement had been reduced. The amount was legal and publicly disclosed. The committee itself was also legal, but its largest financial supporter was a holding company connected to Charles Vance's business network. This still does not prove the mayor changed the project for money, Nia said. No, Claire replied. But look at the date. For days after the contribution, Richard's deputy chief of staff had attended a private dinner with Vance representatives. 9 days later, an internal planning draft reflected the lower affordability requirement. Nia felt the familiar pressure behind her ribs. Not excitement. Responsibility. Send this to Marcus, she said. The next morning, the city ethics office issued subpoenas for additional records related to Riverside comments. Investigators requested private calendars, archived messages, draft agreements, and communications involving Vance urban development. By lunchtime, Richard's deputy chief of staff had retained independent counsel. By evening, one former planning employee had agreed to cooperate with investigators. Richard stood alone in his office as the city lights came on below. His television played silently across the room. Every station showed the same building, the same questions, the same photograph of him beside Charles Vance at a fundraiser 2 years earlier. His phone buzzed with a message from Madison. Dad, please tell me this is going away. Richard read it twice. Then another message appeared, this one from Margaret. Investigators had recovered an earlier draft of the Riverside Agreement from an archived city server. Richard walked slowly back to his desk and opened the attachment. The original 20% affordable housing requirement was clearly visible. Beneath it was a revision history showing when the number had changed and which office had requested the edit. Richard stopped breathing for a moment. The request had not come from the planning department. It had come from his own executive office. Richard stared at the revision history until the letters blurred together. The request had been entered by his executive policy office 6 months earlier, 2 days after a private dinner with Charles Vance. Richard remembered the evening clearly now. Charles had argued that 20% affordable housing would make the project financially unstable. He had spoken about construction costs, interest rates, and investors who could take their money elsewhere. Richard had listened. Then he had told his deputy chief of staff to ask the planning department what flexibility existed. At the time, he had called it negotiation. Looking at the record now, he understood how different it appeared when placed beside campaign contributions, private meetings, and a public process that had continued as though nothing had already been influenced behind closed doors. Margaret entered without knocking. The council president wants an emergency meeting. Richard closed the document. When? Tomorrow morning. And the donors? Margaret hesitated. 3 more suspended support. Richard looked around the office that had once felt permanent. Photographs covered one wall. School openings, neighborhood festivals, election nights. His hand raised as he took the oath of office. Every image showed a room full of people. Now the room was empty. What about Charles? He asked. His attorneys say he will cooperate with investigators. Richard almost laughed, but no sound came. Across town, Nia stood outside a community center where residents from the Riverside neighborhood had gathered for an emergency meeting. Television crews waited near the sidewalk, but she walked past them. Inside, nearly 100 folding chairs faced a small stage. An older woman named Mrs. Evelyn Carter sat in the front row holding a rent notice in both hands. She had lived in the neighborhood for 32 years. They keep talking about percentages on television, Evelyn told Nia. I just want to know if I can stay in my home. Nia sat beside her. That is why the percentage matters. Evelyn nodded slowly. Then make them remember we are people before we are numbers. The sentence stayed with Nia when she stepped to the microphone 20 minutes later. She did not mention Madison. She did not celebrate the investigation. She explained what 20% affordable housing meant compared with 8%. She explained how public hearings were supposed to work and why residents deserved to know whether decisions had been shaped before their voices were heard. When she finished, the room remained quiet for a moment before people began asking questions. Real questions. Not about the viral video. About rent, transit, property taxes, schools, home. At City Hall the next morning, Richard entered the council chamber through a side door. Seats that had once been filled with allies now held people who avoided his eyes. The council president requested that all Riverside Commons negotiations be suspended pending the investigation. The motion passed overwhelmingly. Then came another announcement. The State Ethics Commission had requested copies of the city's records for an independent review. Richard felt the room shift. This was no longer something his administration could contain internally. After the meeting, Madison waited in his office. She looked smaller without the confidence she had carried into Bellwether Grill. Is this because of me? She asked. Richard removed his jacket and placed it across a chair. No. Madison looked surprised. You said something you should not have known, he continued. But you did not create what was already there. She lowered her eyes. I made it public. Yes. Richard sat behind his desk. For the first time, he did not know what authority could fix. His phone rang again. Margaret answered it from the doorway, listened, then covered the receiver. Richard, she said quietly, your deputy chief of staff has agreed to testify under oath about who ordered the housing requirement changed. The office became completely still. Richard looked toward the windows, where morning sunlight covered the city he had spent years believing he could manage. Power had once meant knowing which call to make. Now every call seemed to remove another person from his side. And somewhere beneath the fear, he understood the truth he had avoided from the beginning. The greatest threat to his career had never been Nia Bennett. It was the record of the choices he had made when he believed nobody outside the room would ever see them. By noon, every major news outlet in the city wanted Nia Bennett in front of a camera. Producers offered live interviews, exclusive segments, and primetime appearances. One network wanted her seated across from a political commentator who had spent the previous week questioning her motives. Another wanted to replay the restaurant video while asking how it felt to watch the Whitmore administration collapse. Nia declined them all. She was standing beside the copier at Harbor Bridge when Elena called. You understand that everyone is going to tell your story whether you speak or not, Elena said. Then I will speak when there is something worth saying. The deputy chief of staff testified this morning. Nia stopped. The copier continued feeding paper into the tray. What did he say? According to two sources, Richard personally directed his office to seek a lower affordability requirement after meeting with Charles Vance. Investigators are also reviewing whether the public process was intentionally kept moving without disclosing those discussions. Nia closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of Evelyn Carter holding the rent notice in both hands. Can you prove it? Not enough to publish every detail yet. Then wait. Elena gave a tired laugh. You are becoming very inconvenient for a reporter. Good. That afternoon, Nia received an invitation to speak at a press conference organized by several community groups. Aaron expected her to accept immediately. This is your chance, he said. For what? To answer them. Madison humiliated you. The mayor's office tried to discredit you. Now everyone knows they were hiding something. Nia looked through the conference room window at the neighborhood maps pinned across the wall. If I stand in front of those cameras and make this about what they did to me, what happens to Riverside Commons? Aaron hesitated. People still care. For how long? She turned back to him. A scandal is interesting. Housing policy is not. That is exactly why we cannot let the scandal become the whole story. That evening, Nia agreed to speak, but on her terms. The community center was crowded when she stepped behind the microphone. Camera lights brightened her face. Reporters waited for anger. Nia unfolded a single sheet of paper. What happened to me at lunch was wrong, she began. Being judged before being heard is something too many Black Americans understand without needing a video to explain it. The room became still. But I am not here to ask this city to humiliate another person for humiliating me. Several reporters lowered their pens for a second. I am here because hundreds of families were told they would have a voice in decisions about their homes. If those decisions were influenced before those families entered the room, then that is where our attention belongs. She spoke for less than 4 minutes. No insults. No demands for revenge. She asked for the investigation to continue independently, for all redevelopment negotiations to be made transparent, and for displaced residents to receive a meaningful seat in future planning. When she finished, a reporter shouted, "Do you want Mayor Whitmore to resign?" Nia paused. "I want the evidence to decide what accountability looks like." Across town, Richard watched the broadcast alone in his office. Madison stood silently near the doorway. When Nia refused to demand his resignation, Richard felt something he had not expected. Shame. Not relief. Shame. The woman his administration had tried to reduce to an angry activist had shown more restraint with his future than he had shown with her reputation. Madison watched her father turn off the television. "She could have destroyed us up there," she whispered. Richard looked at the dark screen. "No," he said quietly. "She could have enjoyed watching us destroy ourselves." The next morning, the State Ethics Commission announced that investigators had found sufficient evidence to proceed with formal hearings into undisclosed influence over Riverside Commons and the administration's response after the inquiry began. Richard read the announcement at his kitchen table before sunrise. Beside it sat a handwritten note from Madison. For the first time, it contained no request for him to fix anything. It contained only one sentence. "I think I finally understand what I did to her." Richard folded the note carefully. Outside, the city was beginning another ordinary morning. But inside the Whitmore house, privilege had finally reached the one door it could not open. Consequence. The formal hearings lasted 11 days, but Richard Whitmore understood the ending before the final witness left the room. The evidence did not show a single dramatic exchange where someone had openly traded public policy for money. It showed something quieter and, in some ways, more damaging. Private access had shaped decisions before ordinary residents were invited to speak. Richard's executive office had requested the reduction in affordable housing requirements after meetings with Charles Vance. His administration had failed to disclose the full extent of those discussions. Then, when questions began, his communications team had tried to shift public suspicion toward Nia instead of answering them. On Friday morning, Richard entered City Hall through the same front doors he had used for nearly 6 years. Reporters waited behind the barriers outside, but he did not stop. His office had already been packed into cardboard boxes. Photographs were gone from the walls. The empty spaces they left seemed brighter than the pictures had ever been. Margaret stood beside his desk. "The council has the votes to begin removal proceedings," she said quietly. Richard nodded. "I know." He looked through the window at the city below. "Schedule the press conference." 2 hours later, Richard announced his resignation. He did not blame the media. He did not mention political enemies. He acknowledged that his administration had allowed private influence to enter a process that should have remained transparent, and that his response to scrutiny had made the failure worse. Across town, Nia watched only the first minute of the broadcast before turning off her phone. Diane sat beside her at the kitchen table. "You do not want to hear the rest?" she asked. Nia looked at the folder containing the revised Riverside Commons proposal. The 20% affordable housing requirement had been restored pending a complete public review. "This matters more," she said. 3 days later, Madison asked to meet her. Nia almost refused, but finally agreed to a small coffee shop several miles from City Hall. Madison arrived alone, without the polished confidence Nia remembered from Bellwether Grill. She sat across from Nia and wrapped both hands around a paper cup. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. "I thought my name made me important," Madison finally said. Nia studied her face. There was no camera nearby, no audience waiting for a perfect apology. "Your name made people afraid to correct you," Nia replied. Madison lowered her eyes. I know that now. Knowing it now does not erase what happened. I know that too. Nia waited for an excuse, but none came. Madison swallowed. I treated you like you were beneath me because I assumed nobody would make me answer for it. And when everything started falling apart, I blamed you. Her voice became quieter. You could have humiliated me back. Nia looked through the window at people crossing the parking lot beneath the late afternoon sun. Humiliation would not have protected one family in Riverside. Madison's eyes filled with shame, but Nia did not rescue her from it. Some discomfort needed to remain long enough to become understanding. I am sorry, Madison said. Nia nodded once. Then become someone who would never do it again. There was no embrace, no sudden friendship. Forgiveness was not a performance, and accountability was not the same as reconciliation. When Nia stood to leave, Madison spoke again. Was it really one call that ended my father's career? Nia stopped beside the table. No, she said. One call only opened the door. She looked back at Madison. His choices were already waiting on the other side. 3 months later, the folding chairs inside the Riverside Community Center were filled before the meeting began. There were no velvet ropes, private dining rooms, or carefully arranged campaign photographs. Just neighbors carrying folders, parents holding children on their laps, small business owners arriving after work, and elderly residents who had lived on the same streets for decades. Nia sat in the second row beside Diane, a yellow legal pad resting on her knees. She was no longer the woman everyone recognized only from a restaurant video. The attention had faded, as attention always did. New scandals had replaced old ones. Television trucks had moved on, but the work remained. At the front of the room, the City Planning Commission presented a revised Riverside Commons proposal. The restored affordable housing requirement was only the beginning. New protections had been added for existing tenants. Relocation assistance had been expanded, and neighborhood representatives would now hold permanent seats on the Redevelopment Advisory Committee. Nothing was perfect. Some residents still opposed the project. Others supported it. But for the first time, disagreement was happening in a room where the people most affected were being allowed to finish their sentences. Nia looked toward the front row and saw Evelyn Carter holding a printed copy of the proposal. When public comment began, Evelyn walked slowly to the microphone. The room settled. My name is Evelyn Carter, she said, adjusting the microphone with both hands. I have lived in Riverside for 32 years, and I would like to talk about what home means when people with more money decide your neighborhood has suddenly become valuable. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody checked a watch. Nobody whispered that the important people were waiting. Nia felt Diane's hand rest lightly over hers. That is the story, Diane whispered. Nia nodded. Across town, Richard Whitmore was no longer surrounded by staff members or cameras. He had withdrawn from public life and begun cooperating with the remaining reviews of his administration. Madison had disappeared from social events for a while, then quietly started volunteering with a legal aid organization that helped tenants understand housing notices. Nia heard about it from someone else. Madison never called to make sure she knew. That mattered more than any public apology could have. When the meeting ended, residents remained in small groups, discussing transit routes, construction schedules, rent protections, and the future of their streets. Nia helped Evelyn gather her papers. You think they listened? Evelyn asked. Nia looked toward the officials still answering questions instead of leaving through a side door. I think they know they have to now. Outside, evening light stretched across the parking lot. The air smelled faintly of rain on warm pavement. Nia stood beneath the community center awning while Diane searched for her car keys. Her phone vibrated inside her bag. For a moment, Nia simply looked at it. Months earlier, one call had carried a question beyond the walls where powerful people expected it to disappear. But the call had never been the miracle. Elena had followed the records. Marcus had followed the evidence. Residents had kept speaking. Investigators had kept asking. Richard's own choices had done the rest. Nia silenced the phone and slipped it back into her bag. Through the open doors behind her, she could still hear people talking. Ordinary voices. Unpolished voices. Voices that had once been treated as obstacles to decisions already made. She smiled softly and stepped into the evening beside her mother. She had not changed the city by becoming more powerful than the people who dismissed her. She had changed one small part of it by refusing to disappear when they expected her to. And somewhere inside a plain community room, An empty chair waited for the next person who had something worth hearing.